Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dean Woodbeck from InCommon and Internet 2, and this is IAM Online. IAM Online is brought to you by Internet 2 and InCommon and the EDUCAUSE Higher Education Information Security Council. We're taking questions today via the chat, and you will see at the bottom of your screen there's a button to push for the chat. When you open the chat, please make sure that you're sending it to everyone. I think the default, it says to all panelists. So if you do that, then your question is only seen by the panelists and not by everybody. And then if somebody answers it, the answer may not make a whole lot of sense. So if you could take a minute to do that and pose your questions as the speakers go along. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Heather Flanagan, who is our moderator today. And she is a woman of many hats. So I will let her talk about which is which. Heather?
Certainly. So some of you may know me from my role with REFEDS, the R&E Federation Consortium, or you may know me from my work with ID Pro, which is a professional organization for IAM practitioners. But today, I'm not wearing those hats. I'm wearing the hat of the Program Director for SeamlessAccess. SeamlessAccess is a service governed as a coalition between 5 organizations: Géant, Internet 2, the National Information Standards Organization, also known as NISO, ORCID, and the International Association of STM Publishers. Participants include researchers, service providers, libraries, identity providers, federation operators, vendors, publishers. We have quite a large group participating in the project. Our goal is to develop and run a service designed to help streamline the online access experience for researchers using scholarly collaboration tools, information resources, and basically shared research infrastructure. In short, we're trying to improve a piece of the federated authentication workflow in order to make the user experience significantly better when they're accessing scholarly resources. Today's webinar, Simplifying Federated Access to Scholarly Content and Services, will highlight how different groups on campuses are approaching support for users and how the scholarly communications industry is using federated technologies like SeamlessAccess and GetFTR, which stands for Get Full Text Research, to enable access. And with that, I would like to introduce Lisa Janicki-Hinchliffe and Robert Youngin, our speakers for today. Lisa is a professor as well as coordinator for the Information Literacy Services and Instruction in the University Library and affiliate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her responsibilities encompass instruction programs for library users and professional development for library staff and faculty, as well as campus outreach and collaborations relating to teaching and learning. Lisa has consulted, presented, and published widely on the scholarly communications publishing, the value of libraries, strategic planning, organizational information, emerging technologies, program evaluation, and more. Her clients include libraries, colleges and universities, scholarly and professional associations, and nonprofit organizations and for-profit companies in the library business community. So if you think I wear a lot of hats, you should go look at Lisa's bio. Ralph Youngin is the Senior Director of Technology and Strategy at Partnerships at the American Chemical Society. He has been an incredible ally in helping bridge the communities of interest here. He's been going to Federation operator meetings, he's been reaching out to librarians and presenting at their conferences, and he's helping the scholarly publishers just understand the Federation space. He's past co-chair of RA21, he's a member of the SeamlessAccess Governance Committee, and he's one of the founders of GetFTR. And with that, I turn this over to Lisa and Ralph.
Great, and thank you, Heather, and thank you to Dean, who is going to be our slide jockey, I guess we say here today. So we wanted to start with our topic here today of simplifying federated access to scholarly content and services by setting the stage with the context in which we're discussing this, because we know that to this webinar we have librarians, we have publishers, we have campus IT professionals, and so we need to sort of get on the same page to the extent that we can in a very short period of time. So in general, what we're talking about here is the content that publishers license The library is typically the licensing agency or unit on the campus. So the library licenses that content or services from publishers, and that content or services is then made available to entitled users. And that's an important component of what we have to think about here, because not all who attempt access via a link or some other announcement are going to be entitled. And that may be because they are not actually affiliated with the institution, but they follow a link. Or in certain cases, certain resources and services are only licensed for a subpopulation of the institution. And so there needs to be a mechanism for checking whether people are entitled for access to this licensed resource. We have various authentication and authorization systems working on our campuses, in many cases multiple, to support access for entitled users and to prevent access for non-entitled users. And so it's a two-part situation. So how do we then think about this overall topic, in particularly, of course, with respect to the library world, which is where my professional background is thinking about the personal data that is passed in order to create these entitlements and check these entitlements, especially with respect to user privacy and control over their own personal data. And of course, there are a variety of frameworks that come into play here. Legal frameworks, for example, GDPR. We have contractual frameworks. What has the institution and the library promised to the publisher, and what has the publisher promised to the university or the library about the way this data will be managed? And then we, of course, have our respective ethical frameworks, because certain things might even be legal and contractually okay, and yet might bump up against ethical frameworks of any number of players within this context. So if we take a look at the next slide, there's a couple terms that we've come to realize are used differently in different parts of this community. And so the two that we're going to particularly highlight here today is first the word discovery. In the realm of scholarly communications, publishing, libraries, discovery means conducting a literature search to discover research that is pertinent to one's interest or one topic. And then we sometimes pair that discovery and delivery meaning actually getting the piece of research. And our goal in most cases is for discovery and delivery to be as synonymous as possible, because of course, when somebody discovers an article, they typically would like the full text of that article. So we're driving towards discovery and delivery being the same, but a key word here is discovery. Because what I've personally learned is that in Federation operations, the word discovery does not mean the content. It means searching for one's identity provider in order to initiate an authentication workflow. And so we're going to try hard today to use the word discovery to mean in those federated operations, but particularly if I slip up, Ralph will call me out on it, and we'll figure out to make sure that we're using that phrase similarly. So discovery, we're going to mean finding your identity provider. The next one is metadata, and metadata is also used in these two communities. In scholarly communications, metadata is the information about a published work. It's the author, the title, the page numbers, the dates, the DOI, all sorts of data about that information object. Of course, in Federation operations, metadata is the information about the identity providers and the service providers. So again, we're going to try and keep this straight, but particularly because these terms are used, they're spelled the same, they don't have any qualifiers, discovery and metadata mean different things. And so especially for the librarians in the audience, realize that we're using it today in a way that the federated operations, but for campus IT professionals and people working in other arenas, realize that if you use these words, the immediate meaning that will come to mind for a librarian is the one under the scholarly communications. And so you'll always want to signal that we're using the other one. So let's take a quick look, Dean, if we could, at the scholarly authentication and authorization ecosystem. There are two layers in this process, and I do see that there's a quick question I'm just going to answer so no one's trying to frantically take notes. I think we'll absolutely be happy to share these slides, and we'll either work with Dean to figure out how we do it on their website, or we'll find another place, because we've certainly got other places we can post them. So we've got two layers, if you will, or two categories. You've got the device authorization that can happen, and then you have the individual authentication that can happen. So the first category that we might be very familiar with, especially in libraries, we'll see it's just used a lot, is device authorization. And that's typically through IP address recognition, which means that the IP address is recognized, the IP address of the device is recognized as being within the institutional namespace. It asserts and it sort of assumes that the user of the device is an authorized user. Okay, so the individual is authorized because the device is authorized. I'm patting my laptop as if you can see it. I'm sorry. In remote IP recognition options, we have two categories, virtual private network, VPNs, and the proxy server, which are often in use as well for access to scholarly communications materials. These all operate on recognizing the device as being within the appropriate namespace, and then that device characteristic is transferred with the assumption that the person using the device is therefore an untitled user. There's also another category, which is either paired with or separate from the device. We can check on the individual person and see who you are, and do you have entitlement characteristics. There are publisher-specific accounts. There are certain accounts that get set up with publisher websites. Typically, these are for personalization features, and they don't provide authorization. So after a device is recognized, IP recognition, then a user sets up an account and it gives them personalization. There's another category in the individual authorization, which is the Federated Authentication via SAML, which is the security assertion markup language. This validates the end user, not the device again, and it provides authorization. It says, yes, this individual is an entitled user. Shibboleth is a specific implementation of the SAML protocol. So for a lot of institutions, especially in the United States, we tend to think just Shibboleth, but Shibboleth is an example, a specific implementation of this protocol, which is called SAML. So if we look at this, what we will see, Dean, if we can, yeah. So a library or a given institution may be using any or all of these. And I want to say that I say this from personal experience because my own university, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, we use all of these in different settings, in different setups, which is prioritized first, then second. There's waterfalling, but it's a very complicated environment for authentication and authorization. It's complicated in order to maximize the kinds of access our users can have when they are entitled. And it's also complicated because of the need to make sure that non-entitled users can't, if you will, break through and access things that they shouldn't. What we're going to be talking about today is highlighted on the next slide, which is the Federated Authentication via SAML, in particular the Shibboleth environment. I want to point out that across all of these different mechanisms, there are a variety of security and privacy issues that are addressed in different ways under the different protocols. There are different considerations. And really with all of these, there's trade-offs. Some are more secure, some are more private. There's all sorts of things going on with this. How these particular authentication mechanisms are therefore viewed and evaluated and seen as desirable or non-desirable in somewhat depends on where you sit within this process. So as a librarian, I might bring a certain set of perspectives to this variety of choices and have a priority with them. As a service provider, a publisher may have a different set. And as an end user, who unfortunately often gets left out of these conversations because we don't have sort of a committee representative of the end user, they might have different preferences. And so we really have to be managing a lot of complexity here. So I'm going to ask Dean to go to the next slide. I'm going to turn over to Ralph to unpack this Shibboleth environment a little bit further.
Sure, thanks, Lisa. And yeah, just one more slide to kind of level set and make sure that we're all on the same page here. When we're talking about federated authentication or SAML, or as we often refer to it by its implementation of Shibboleth, It is really a system that involves three parties. There's the end user, there are these identity providers, and there are these service providers. In the space that Lisa and I operate in, identity providers are typically academic institutions. Service providers are those companies that provide services to the research community, like the American Chemical Society that provides scholarly content to the research community. And those are service providers. The particular workflow that we are going to be emphasizing today here is what's illustrated in the diagram, where an end user logs in through her identity provider, and then there are certain attributes about that end user that are passed on to the service provider. Now, from a user experience perspective, that might look very similar to how we log into a website today with like a Google or a Facebook account, but it's actually quite different in one very important way. And that is that these attributes that are provided don't necessarily reveal private information about the end user to the service provider. That's quite different. When you log into a site using Google or Facebook, that site really gets a lot of personal information about you. And that is not necessarily the case. It's really important to understand that difference. And it's important to understand that the identity provider is in control of those attributes that are conveyed to the service provider. So Dean, if you can go forward. So I want to talk a bit now about the understanding what's been going on in the scholarly publishing ecosystem for the last few years. And that journey begins in late 2016 with an initiative that was co-sponsored by the National Information Standards Organization and the International Association of STM Publishers called RA21. And RA21 conducted a number of pilots to experiment with how we could broaden the use of federated authentication throughout our environment. That initiative formally concluded in June of last year with the publication of the NISO recommended practice that I'm showing here on this slide. And that was really the culmination of the RA21 project when we released that NISO recommended practice. So if you go forward, Dean. So Heather has already given you some information about the SeamlessAccess group that is working together. Really think of this as the continuation of RA21. What we are trying to do, what we are doing is we are building an operational service that builds on top of those recommended practices that were published in that RA21 NISO document. So you can go forward, Dean. The sole purpose of that service that SeamlessAccess is building is to improve the user experience around what we know as the "where are you from" challenge with federated authentication. And I list here in the illustrations a few different sites that show how this "where are you from" user experience is different in every single case. Every service provider that you go to has a different implementation of it. Now, in the scholarly publishing space that Lisa and I operate in, that is particularly challenging for researchers, because when they do a literature search, they typically are going from one publisher site to another publisher site as they are trying to access that content that they might be interested in. And when they are off campus and not associated with an IP address that those publishers recognize, navigating this "where are you from" process over and over and over again is quite onerous. And what we have found, and users have told us, is they simply don't do it. They simply abandon that process and don't even try to navigate these. So Dean, if you go forward, I'll do a little illustration here to drive this point home. So I want you to imagine a researcher at Lisa's home institution here. And if you click one more time, imagine that she logs in to CERN one morning to check the results of an experiment that was running there. And she logs into Daria because she's working on a paper with some researchers there in this collaborative authoring environment. And she logs into Mendeley because that uses Mendeley as a research reference manager. And then she reads an article on the ACS Publications site, and she gets an email message saying that she has a open access charge to pay at the Copyright Clearance Center. Now, 4 out of the 5 of these service providers are running Shibboleth today. But if you click one more time, Dean, CCC is not. And on that site, she would have to actually create an account in order to complete her transaction there. But on those other 3 of the other sites, she would have to navigate a where are you from process that looks quite different, on each one of those sites. ACS is the only site that I've listed here that actually has the SeamlessAccess user experience deployed. And on that site, there is a button that she can push that simply says access through her home institution, where she would then be directed to her institutional login page. And click one more time, Dean. What we're driving, the point we want to drive home here is that all of these service providers are absolutely in scope for this seamless access user experience, this same simple pathway to log in through your home institution could be implemented on every one of these sites. So if you click forward, Dean, and I'll turn back to Lisa.
Great, thanks, Ralph. I'm so busy in that last slide. So we wanted to sort of unpack a little bit, because I think we've seen the word seamless access and it gets used in a lot of different ways. And one of the things I really appreciate that Ralph just emphasized in the last slide is that seamless access is ultimately intended to be a user experience, but it is also, of course, a technology and a coalition, and it's a lot of an organization. So it's a lot of other things. But from the perspective of enabling entitled user access and preventing non-entitled user access, what this really does is it puts the opportunity for a site to display the access through your institution button by using data about a user's institution that is accessed in their browser storage. So as you'll see on the left-hand side of this slide, it says access through Imperial College. Now, how does ACS know that me as a user should get access through Imperial College? Well, it kind of doesn't. What it knows is that the last time you used this seamless access experience, you went to the Imperial College London identity provider. That was what you discovered, if you will. And it put a little piece of information into your browser storage, which is what we see on the right-hand side. And it says, hey, this last time this browser went somewhere, they chose Imperial College London. Now you'll also see, if you look really carefully under that large blue button, if by chance, I don't know, I was using a laptop that was somebody else's, and so I don't actually have access through Imperial College London, I can click underneath there on access through another institution and reinitiate a discovery process of my actual identity provider. This is also important in case that that I have multiple affiliations. So maybe sometimes I'm going through one affiliation because I'm an adjunct at Imperial College London, but I'm also permanent faculty somewhere else. And so I need to sometimes toggle back and forth. Obviously, Nirvana eventually will be as if those entitlements can be combined. We're not there, but this is still a much better user experience because it does enable that pathway. So if we look at the next slide, we've put this into words a little bit for you as well. With also saying, okay, so then what does it not do? And we think this is important to understand as well. Seamless access is not involved in the actual Federation authentication process. It discoveries the identity provider, but then the federated authentication process happens through that identity provider. And so for my campus, it would be our Shibboleth implementation that's local. So seamless access would find the University of Illinois federated identity provider but then it would send me through that campus managed process through Shibboleth, with our Federation Identity Provider Coalition being in common as well. So we would be working through that process, which is exactly the same way I work through that process when, for example, my campus course management system moves me over to that federated authentication process. This is a way of scholarly publishers easily initiating that process, but that process is not handled by SeamlessAccess. So what that means is that service providers like the publishers and identity providers like the academic institutions must already have an existing relationship that supports that SAML-based federation authentication for SeamlessAccess to work. So SeamlessAccess works on top of existing setups of this kind of passing back and forth of data. So for example, a campus running Shibboleth is a member of the Identity Federation like in common, such as the University of Illinois. The publisher, such as ACS, is also a member of InCommon and supports the SAML federated authentication. The InCommon Federation is the governing policy framework that facilitates the way this data passes back and forth between all parties in the federation. And so because we've agreed to be, members and trusted parties in this federation, we then trust each other with the data that is passing back and forth. So just said in another way on the next slide, what are the dependencies for SeamlessAccess to work? The institution must have a SAML service or a Shibboleth service or some other SAML-based service. Not all institutions provide this. Large research universities definitely do, but those smaller institutions, particularly the United States, this is a less penetration into that market. The library must request that SAML be enabled on the publisher platform, or that it must be part of some sort of agreement, and the publisher must enable SAML on the platform. In other words, both the publisher and the library have to agree that this is the way we're going to exchange attributes. And then, of course, in order to also have that user experience, the publisher must implement the SeamlessAccess service. So that final step of the SeamlessAccess being implemented is on the publisher, on the service provider to implement. This is not something a library can impose on the publisher. We can encourage it, but we can't impose it. We, as the library side of this, it's our decision, of course, whether or not we would support the SAML-based process, which we can talk later about why there might be some challenges with that. So then a user must authenticate through SAML on a SeamlessAccess enabled publisher platform at some point, because that's what's going to deposit that little piece of information into their browser storage. And then if the user is using the same browser on the same device, then SeamlessAccess will work across all enabled platforms. Okay, so if you are like me and use multiple devices, multiple browsers, this whole process has to get set up essentially into the browser storage on each device, and each device is each browser. But once it's set up, it then lives there in storage. And then the first time that a user hits in a given day of doing their research, a SeamlessAccess authenticated user experience, they're going to have to authenticate. They're going to have to work through that authentication process that is their campus Shibboleth or the like, in order to say, yep, today I'm still Lisa and I'm still affiliated, have my institution confirm that. And then I will have that seamless experience of being recognized across all of the other SeamlessAccess authenticated platforms. So that is the dependencies, as well as sort of the responsibilities, if you will, of the various parties in the system. So publishers have to do something, institutions have to do something, libraries have to do something, and users have to do something. So again, it's a complicated calculus to get this all lined up, but we are definitely seeing that the better user experience of SeamlessAccess is enabling this as truly a more seamless access experience for end users. So let me turn it over to Ralph to talk about some of the other things that SeamlessAccess is besides a user experience.
Yeah, and I'll just, before I dive into that, I'll note a few of the questions in the chat, which was actually just answered, which is great. Yeah, yes, the federations really play a great service here for connecting identity providers with service providers so that we don't have to exchange information with one another bilaterally. These multilateral agreements that we have with federations really streamline that process quite a bit. The question about is there a list of publishers that have SAML enabled? Well, you can look at the service provider listings on the federation sites and see the publishers that are members of those federations. That's probably the best thing to go by. And I'll answer that other question about seamless access in just a second here. So this is just a little bit about the organization of the Seamless Access Initiative. You know, we do have a governance committee that has representation from each of those 5 sponsors that we've talked about. We have a few part-time staff like Heather, who's here with us today, working with us. There's an outreach committee that we have, but I really want to call out this attribute release working group. This has been a really active group over the last few months that is defining those sets of attributes that I talked about earlier about what get released from identity providers to service providers. And I'll highlight that a little bit more in a few slides. And then this contract language working group is something that we will be spinning up soon that talks about the license agreements that campus libraries might have with publishers and what kind of model contract language might be suitable for those agreements. So if you go forward, Dean. Just where we are a bit with our timeline here. So I've talked about the RA21 initiative. And then the seamless access, we are currently in what we're describing as a beta phase of seamless access. And we now believe that that's going to run through the end of this year. We had hoped that that would be completed by the middle of this year, but given where we are with the global situation right now, we recognize that's going to take a little bit longer. And then we anticipate that next year we'd move into a fuller operational stance with Géant and Internet 2 providing support for seamless access. So if you go forward, this is the answer to the earlier question in the chat about who actually has seamless access implemented and who's working on it. So you'll see that the 2 major publishers that have ACS and Springer Nature have seamless access implemented, and then Sunet and Tenet have also got some implementations in place. I want to point out the platform providers on this slide. If you're not familiar with companies like Adapon and Silverchair, these are companies that provide content delivery services to publishers. And so the fact that an ACS is on the Adapon platform, and so the fact that they now have that supported in their platform means that it's much easier for other publishers to join. So that's a really important step to take. Go forward, Dean. So I want to switch gears now and talk a little bit about what's happened in the last few months, a little bit of a case study here at ACS. Back in February, ACS received an email message from the CARSI Federation in China, and I've got some excerpts from that email message here. It wasn't just ACS, they reached out to many other publishers as well. And you note in the email that they were describing how campuses were closing and they were having trouble serving all of their remote access needs through traditional means like VPN. So they were really encouraging us to join their federation and provide federated access to their institutions. And of course, in March, similar things happened in the US and then the rest of the globe as well, where campuses shut down and everybody started working remotely. So if you go forward. So at ACS, we saw a very dramatic increase in the amount of federated authentications happening on our site. If you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that in March, we had a 26-fold increase in federated authentications, and in April, a 52-fold increase in federated authentications. And while I'm not at liberty to reveal the actual numbers on this graph, you know, I will say that that monthly average that was consistent, you know, for a long period of time there, that was not just tens or hundreds of authentications, that was thousands of authentications that were taking place there. So this ramp up has been extremely dramatic. And I think there are 3 contributing factors to this, and they're listed in my bullet points here. So one, clearly lots of demand across the globe for remote access. Point number 2, though, is it just happens that we were in the queue to implement our seamless access user experience on March 1st. And I have to believe that that has had a dramatic impact on the uptake of federated authentication because it makes using it so much simpler. And then the third thing that we did is we enabled many institutions, we increased the number of institutions that had federated access capabilities. And there were really 2 flavors to that. ACS has been a member of InCommon, I haven't looked, but probably for almost like a decade or so. But we, and we were also members of other federations too. But we only had about 10 or 15 academic institutions enabled for federated access. And that was simply because it's been a long-standing practice among publishers to only enable those institutions that requested federated access for their campus. That doesn't mean that the SAML metadata exchange didn't happen. You know, that happened, you know, almost a decade ago, and many of the schools were ready to federate with us. We just completed our side of that configuration by assigning the entity ID to a particular contract, and then that allowed the institution to appear on our Where Are You From page. We've also been joining many other national federations for the last few months as well, so we're really expanding the use dramatically. So if you go forward, Dean. Well, go forward on the slide, Dean. Uh-oh. Dean, are you there?
Well, this will make things a little bit challenging.
Yeah.
Well, while we're waiting for Dean to come back online, should we ask a few of the questions that we didn't get to?
Yeah, please. I wasn't looking at those while I was speaking, so.
Yeah, of course. So earlier, Ann West asked, must the institution be a member of a research and education federation, such as InCommon or the Canadian Access Federation, to participate?
So no, definitely do not have to be. As I said earlier, it makes things a lot easier where we don't have to do these configurations one-on-one kind of manually with institutions, but that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. So Dean, okay, perhaps Dean could stop sharing and I could just share.
I'm not sure Dean has any control whatsoever.
Yeah, he unfortunately also is the one who has to give us the capability to share. So
unless Aaron, are you a host that could do this also?
I am just asking Dean if I could get a copy of the slides, then I should be able to share.
So I think if you can just give sharing ability to either me or Ralph, we both have them up and can do it.
Unfortunately, Dean is the actual host, so I'm getting I'm not able to allow it.
Okay.
Okay.
Do one of you have the slides that you can send me the link real quick and then I can screen share?
Yeah, can you put your email address in the
Yep.
the chat? Ralph, can you answer the question about the browser support for the user seamless access experience?
Yeah, it does work across all the modern browsers. So I see some comments coming up in here about it does rely on JavaScript. That is accurate. We did have an issue early on with, I think it was Internet Explorer 11, where it wasn't supported, but I think we even got it working, you know, for that. So it is supported by the modern browsers.
I would add one point to this. For folks that really want to dive into the gory technical details of browser technologies and some of the challenges we're having with that, because a lot of the federated authentication looks a lot like what ad networks do. We're seeing some interesting challenges there. There's going to be a technical webinar hosted by NISO on May 26th, where we're going to talk about that. It will be a very technical webinar, and I believe they've got it announced on the NISO website.
So if I can answer Ranty's question while we're waiting to see, I've got Erin should be getting the slides. So Ranty, basically if a publisher does not implement the seamless access user experience with the graphic that you're seeing, right, the blue box with the little university pillars thing next to it, the user will continue to see the same identity discovery experience that they saw yesterday, right? So that's why if you can think back to the slide that Ralph showed you, where the current day of what the University of Illinois user would see. So when they go to the Elsevier site, they'll see the current identity discovery, the current discovery process for identity provider. And if they go to another site, they'll see the current one. So what this really is about is creating an alternative that publishers can use, that they can be confident that the user is likely to have experienced that same discovery service process before. But if not, they can continue to have the one that they had before. So there's no obligation on a publisher. There's just if you will, the pitch for them is that you know, the user experience is better here, and then also the fact that they can use that browser stored data to even do a better job of saying, hey, your institution's name will appear in this little blue box rather than just your institution. So there's nothing the user can do if there's not seamless access except, you know, suffer through the panoply of possible user experiences that they'll see across different publisher sites. I think that answers your question, but feel free to say a little bit more. Ralph, I'm wondering if we just want to talk through the lessons learned.
That's exactly what I thought I would just forge ahead and do. And the slides, you know, we will make the slides available afterwards. But so another lesson learned from the ACS experience is that those attribute release policies are kind of all over the place. You know, we do not require personally identifiable attributes in order to access content, and that was really a strong recommendation driven by the library community that Lisa represents, where customers that want to access library resources should not be required to personally identify themselves to do so. And that is perfectly fine. You know, we believe that it should be, personalization services should be a more deliberate step up from that. But when we expanded our federated authentication use, we found many, many campuses that were asserting personal attributes to us. Now, we intended for our site to throw them away, you know, anything personally identifiable to just throw away. The reason we discovered this is because we did have a bug on our site that in certain situations, a user's first name was being reflected back to themselves on the site in a, you know, welcome Mary message at the top of the screen. That's now been fixed, but this really just highlighted the need, you know, to have more easily configurable sets of attributes that IDPs can select for certain service providers. So again, this is really calling out the work that the Seamless Access group is doing to provide those attribute sets and those definitions. The other thing that I'll say, another lesson learned was we found a number of university systems that run a single identity provider for multiple campuses. Now, while I certainly understand why for efficiency purposes that makes a whole lot of sense, it actually complicates our lives quite a bit, because we license content to an individual campus, not to a system typically. And so one campus might have authorized access and another campus might not. Even more than that, usage reporting is very important to the libraries. And so we need to be able to differentiate, you know, that this user is from campus A and this user is from campus B, so that we make sure that we get the usage reports correct. And when you're running a single identity provider for a university system, there's no consistent way of being able to assert which user is a member of which campus. So I've been working with David Bantz from who runs the University of Alaska system on how to do that. But here again, it's a unique scheme that we're developing, and it's not a standard. And when I go over to Indiana or Michigan or wherever, you know, it'll be a whole different conversation about how to do it. So that's been a complication. And then the final thing is, and it's too bad we don't have the graphic for this so you could see it, but attribute release screens, you know, where the identity provider reflects back to the user, here's what I'm about to release about you. Are you okay with this? There are a few situations we've seen where those attributes release consent screens are in place, but they're far and few between. I think that would be a good thing, you know, for identity providers to introduce that user experience. And finally, also on the identity provider side, make use of our what's called the MDUI elements that service providers put into their metadata. This is the name, the logo, the service description. If you reflect those back on your institutional login pages, I think it can help the user quite a bit to understand the authentication workflow. So those were the lessons learned that I wanted to cover. I guess we still don't have the slides, right?
No. So I'm just going to talk about GetFTR in the most generic of ways right now, which is to just share that in addition to this sort of discover your identity provider and then have that saved within the browser, so that then the next time that the user comes back to the browser, it says like, hey, do you want to use your same institutional login again? And as a reminder, that is not the login, it's not the authentication, it's the discovery provider, it's the discovery process for the identity provider. The user still then has to go through the identity provider. We can start to see that publishers have also, and libraries are asking that we continue to improve the discovery experience in the library way of saying it, which is that you actually get the content right away as well. And so GetFTR is sort of it's not dependent on seamless access, but it's another one of these activities currently going on that's about getting better access to content in an easy way for users. So what that does is it leverages federated authentication to do on-the-fly verification of a user's entitlements in order to basically say, hey, if you authenticate, you will get this PDF. In other words, we can sort of like pre-promise you the PDF. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's definitely a problem without the slide. So we will, maybe we'll even set up another one at some point, Ralph. You and I can get deep into GetFTR for this community, which I think might be of interest to them. So just a few additional kind of final thoughts that we wanted to sort of bring to you today, which is that SeamlessAccess has done some research into sort of what will it take to build capacity at institutions in order to support the kinds of user experience that we're hoping for in a way that is reflective of all sorts of obligations that we've talked about, legal, contractual, ethical. So what it really comes down to is campus IT and campus libraries need to work together and determine the appropriate attribute release policies for those service providers that work through the library to make sure that the attribute release is appropriate. Implement those policies as a good user experience on campus to supplement and complement the seamless access user experience to discover the identity provider. And then of course, library IT and campus IT have to work together on how we make sure that contractual language is reflective both of our expectations of the service providers, as well as to be clear on what we can and cannot guarantee as an identity provider for the service providers. So there's definitely some room for improvement between campus IT and campus libraries. This survey that was done really showed that there's some opportunity to grow, where only 72% of IT respondents said that they had implemented federated authentication for library resources. 46% of library respondents said that they had implemented federated authentication. The trick here is we can't say that that means libraries didn't know what IT was doing, because these weren't necessarily librarians and IT professionals at the same institutions. And so this mostly just gives us a dip in and says, okay, clearly we don't have 100% penetration of federated authentication, which definitely means that we can't have seamless access operating everywhere. 88% of library respondents who had implemented federated authentication said they had worked with their campus IT unit, which I think does show us that there is a heavy dependency for those libraries that have implemented federated authentication on working collaboratively with IT. But IT often implements federated authentication for the campus without involving the library, because of course federated authentication can be used for reasons beyond the library. In fact, you could have federated authentication happening and no library services set up within it at all. And so there's just a need for us to have better understanding on our own campuses. And of course, the publishers can be our partners, I think, with this. And this kind of seamless access is not really about federated identity, but it's raised the specter, it's raised the importance of really figuring out these federated identity issues. So Ralph, I think you had a couple final thoughts, and then we'll have a few more minutes for questions.
Yep. So in closing, I want to make a few points. So, I talked earlier about the fact that we don't need personally identifiable attributes coming through the SAML assertions. But what we really, really, really would like are pseudonymous identifiers, pseudonymous attributes. The reason for that is because publishers like ACS are often kind of an early awareness service almost to campuses, where sometimes we detect anomalous usage on our platforms. And many times when we detect that anomalous usage and we contact the campus, they will find that someone has had their credentials compromised. And so if we had the ability to hand back a pseudonymous identifier to the campus, even though that is not personally identifiable, even though the publisher doesn't know who it is and doesn't, there's no concern about privacy there, it would be a wonderful piece of forensic information that we could pass back to the campus, so the campus could more quickly identify the user that potentially has compromised credentials. So that's and I know there's some work being done right now on naming a new pairwise persistent identifier. As of right now, I think the edge of person targeted ID is in common use, but anyhow, that's what we would really like to see. Second point I want to make is that I think it's pretty clear that the federated authentication use is expanding within our community pretty dramatically, and I think that will continue. It's hard to provide really good statistics about how much seamless access is being used, because we're very deliberately not logging very much at all in the seamless access service. But I asked the group to take a look, and they said, using a very conservative approach, they think that in the month of April, between 1 to 2 million user flows took place through seamless access. And that's primarily probably just from ACS and from Nature, who, the two larger publishers that have it implemented. So already it's experiencing a pretty high level of use. And then the last thing I'll comment on is we're starting to also get questions from institutions that are not members of InCommon or any of these federations. And a little bit of a digital divide is happening there, where they're saying, okay, you know, my campus isn't big enough to support our own Shibboleth implementation. You know, how can I get involved? And, you know, how can I get, you know, support for my patrons, you know, to participate here? So I think it would be great if the federated operator community could, you know, step up and have, you know, better ways of getting some of those smaller institutions on board. And that was the last thing I wanted to say. So Heather, I haven't been watching the questions. Any things that we should be taking here?
Sure. There's been some very useful conversation going on.
I'm answering some in the chat, so but
I know
I'd love
it's
to
interesting
actually
to keep...
respond to them verbally too. So
sure. Well, do you want to pick your favorite one then?
So there are a couple of questions about, well, why don't we just auto redirect? I mean, why are we making people press a button at all? And of course, the issue there is that, remember, this is browser and device specific. So you might have multiple people with different affiliations using the same browser and the device. They shouldn't be directed off, particularly because if they get sent off to an institution that they don't have an entitlement with, they have no way of getting back to your publisher content, because they every time they hit it, they're just going to be bounced to this place they are not allowed to be entitled with. Secondly, the people might have multiple affiliations, and until we can also manage that multiple affiliation better, we just can't make that process automatic. There was a question of how long an IDP session lasts. That is at the discretion of the IDP. Most institutions set them for a couple of hours. There are security reasons why you don't want IDP sessions to just be infinite. And so there's that question of, well, between infinite and 2 minutes, how long do you want it to be? The RA21 made a recommendation, I believe, Ralph, was it a 10-hour window, but most institutions are not leaving them open for 10 hours. Yeah. And on top of which is, we haven't mentioned, but I mean, for me at my own institution, on top of the identity provider, I also have to do a daily 2-factor authentication on the identity provider service. So in addition, so it's actually going to be affected like multiple layers of security here. So we're always trading off that sort of security friction with the convenience friction for the user. And most campuses are setting that for other reasons that have to do with the fact that this IDP is also what's running your access to your HR system, your payroll system, your financial aid system, your grading system. So these are just set at a much more broad level than we might granularity, eventually want to be able to set them up.
And I think that more or less takes us to the top of the hour. If you want to keep track of what's going on with the Seamless Access project, you can go to our website, https://seamlessaccess.org, and there is an email button to contact@seamlessaccess.org, which will notify me to get you on the announced mailing list. And I'm sure there will be other conversations as they need to happen on mailing lists at your favorite virtual session and anywhere else people gather to talk about these things.